in May of 1912 on a low rise above the shore of Lake Delavan in southern Wisconsin. Two brothers named Phillips pushed their shovels into the side of an ancient earthen mound and opened the ground on something that should not have been there. They were not treasure hunters chasing a rumor. They were working carefully, under the direction of a scientific survey connected to Beloit College, one of the oldest and most respected institutions in the state, a place with a real museum and a real tradition of studying the thousands of prehistoric mounds that dot that part of the country. What the brothers expected as they cut into that mound was the ordinary harvest of such a dig. A few bundles of old bones, some pottery, the quiet remains of the people who had raised the mound centuries before. What they found instead, as the trench widened and the black soil came away shovel by shovel, was 18 skeletons. And not one of them was ordinary. 18. Hold on to that number, because everything about this story turns on it. 18 skeletons laid into that single mound above the lake. And the accounts that came out of that dig, carried in the Wisconsin papers and picked up by the Chicago press, did not describe ordinary human remains. They described giants, heights that ran from 7.5 feet to over 9. And it was not only the size. The skulls were wrong. They were described as elongated, drawn back and upward in a shape that no ordinary human skull takes, with the brow and the jaw sitting in proportions that the diggers said did not match any people they knew. Some accounts went further and spoke of a double row of teeth. The bones were measured. The find was notable enough and solid enough that it did not stay a local curiosity. It reached the front pages of a major American city under headlines about a lost race of giants pulled from the Wisconsin earth. And then, within a single season, it was gone. The skeletons, the measurements, the mound itself, the whole discovery slid out of the record almost as fast as it had entered it. 18 giant skeletons, documented in the press, examined under academic supervision, and then, quietly, nothing. Today, the official position is that it never amounted to anything at all. Let me walk you through exactly what came out of that ground, because the details are far more specific than the people who wave this story away would like you to remember. Start with the place itself. The mound sat on Lake Lawn Farm, on the shore of Lake Delavan, in a corner of Wisconsin that holds one of the greatest concentrations of ancient earthworks anywhere in North America. This is not a figure of speech. Wisconsin was, before the plow and the city took most of them, home to many thousands of prehistoric mounds, conical burial mounds, long linear mounds, and above all the effigy mounds, enormous earthen figures shaped like birds, bears, panthers, and long serpentine forms so large that their shapes can only truly be read from the air. Not far from Lake Delavan stands Astellan, a genuine and thoroughly documented ancient walled settlement with flat-topped pyramidal mounds, a site so sophisticated it forced archaeologists to rethink what the people of this region were capable of. So the mound the Phillips brothers opened was not a random hillock in a farmer's field. It was one feature in a vast, mapped, ancient landscape of the dead, a landscape that people had been building and burying in for a very long time. And the men who opened it were not fools or fabricators. They were working under scientific supervision, and when that first oversized skull came out of the soil, the response was not to hide it or sell it. It was to send for the experts. Word went to Beloit College, whose museum men had been surveying and cataloguing these very mounds for decades. Men who knew exactly what an ordinary prehistoric skeleton looked like, because they had handled hundreds of them. Measurements were taken at the site. The heights were recorded. The unusual shape of the skulls was noted specifically enough that it became the very center of the newspaper accounts. This is the part that should stop you. This was 1912, not the misty deep past. This was a documented event with named people, a named place, a specific date, and specific numbers reported in print in a major city, under the supervision of a respected college. A reader in Chicago in the spring of 1912 could open the paper and read that 18 giant skeletons with elongated skulls had been taken from a mound on Lake Delavan under the eye of trained men. That is not a campfire legend whispered down the generations. That is a news event with a paper trail. And then the paper trail goes cold, because here is where it turns strange, and here is where the crack opens. Where are they? Those 18 skeletons do not sit today in a glass case in the Beloit Museum with a placard, where you would absolutely expect the most remarkable human remains ever pulled from that county to be displayed. The detailed measurements did not become a published academic paper that a curious person can pull off a library shelf and read. The find that was solid enough to reach a metropolitan front page simply stops being mentioned in the serious record. It becomes a thing that responsible people are told did not really happen, or was exaggerated, or was a muddle of ordinary bones and enthusiastic reporters. And that is the pattern I want you to watch for, because it does not happen only once, when the most sensational element of a scientific find is precisely the element that vanishes. Not the pottery, not the ordinary bones, but the giant skeletons with the wrong-shaped skulls. You are entitled to ask why. You are entitled to ask who handled them last, and where the trail went cold, and how a country that keeps meticulous museum inventories somehow mislaid 18 skeletons that would have rewritten the story of who once lived on this land. 18 skeletons. Measured, reported, gone. And if this were the only time it had ever happened, you could shrug it off and move on. A small-town dig, a hungry newspaper, a mix-up, an honest loss. These things happen, but Lake Delavan is not the only time. It is not even close. Once you start pulling the thread, you find that the 19th and early 20th centuries in America are littered with these accounts. The same shape, the same decade after decade, the same disappearance, until the coincidence begins to strain and then to snap. This is the part they would rather you never lay side by side. So let me lay it out. Go back 15 years before Delavan to 1897, and just a state away, to reports out of Maple Creek and other Wisconsin mound country, where diggers opening earthworks described unusually large skeletons with, once again, oddly shaped and oversized skulls. Same state, same kind of mound, same anomaly, same fade to silence. Cross into Illinois that same year to Dunleith, where railroad workers cutting through a mound were reported to have uncovered a skeleton of extraordinary length, lying among a great mass of bones. Move east into the Ohio country, the Ashtabula finds, and countless others, where reports across the whole 19th century described entire burial grounds, thousands of graves, many holding oversized remains, ploughed flat, and built over until nothing was left to examine. Go to West Virginia, to the Grave Creek Mound, one of the largest conical burial mounds in the entire country, a real, standing, documented monument you can visit today, where 19th century excavations pulled out remains and a small inscribed stone that scholars have argued over ever since, and where, once more, the most anomalous material has a way of not being available for a clean second look. And here is the part that the skeptics can never quite explain away, because it is not amateurs and newspapermen doing the finding this time. It is the United States government. In the 1880s, the Smithsonian Institution, through its Bureau of Ethnology, ran an enormous official, federally funded survey of the American mounds, the Great Mound Survey, directed by a man named Cyrus Thomas, and in its own published reports, buried in the dry official language, are entries recording skeletons of remarkable size. A skeleton measured at over 7 feet in one mound, large-framed, oversized remains in another. The very institution that today is most associated with insisting that the giants are a myth catalogued, in its own paperwork, human remains that did not fit the ordinary pattern, and then interpreted them away and moved on, and the bones went into the vast national collection where the public simply cannot follow them. So ask the question plainly: how many oversized skeletons does the official record have to contain before there are no giants stops being a scientific finding and starts being a policy? How many mounds have to be ploughed flat? how many finds shipped off for study and never returned, how many boxes catalogued and then mislaid, before the pattern of loss itself becomes the evidence, because that is what Lake Delavan really is. It is not a lonely oddity. It is one clear, dated, documented instance of a pattern that repeats across the whole continent and the whole era, a pattern with a shape so consistent that once you see it, you cannot unsee it. A physical anomaly comes up out of the ground. It is real enough to be measured, real enough to be reported, real enough that the right experts are called in to look at it. And then, instead of becoming a world-famous exhibit and a rewritten chapter in the human story, it quietly disappears. The bones scattered or crated or lost, the site ploughed or flooded or paved, the report dismissed or misplaced, until all that remains is a yellowed newspaper column that serious people will tell you not to take seriously. 18 skeletons on Lake Delavan, 3 at Maple Creek, a giant among the bones at Dunleith, thousands of graves in the Ohio country, a 7-foot skeleton in the government's own survey. Each one, taken alone, is an anecdote you can explain away. Laid side by side, decade after decade, in the same shape, in the same silence, they are something else entirely. They are a pattern of loss too consistent and too convenient to keep calling an accident. Now, I want to be fair, because being fair is the only way any of this holds weight. There is a real and reasonable case on the other side, and it deserves to be stated. Old newspapers of that era were sensational and often unreliable, quick to inflate a good story into a great one. Bones in wet ground can shift and distort. Poorly measured remains, or remains laid out incompletely, can be exaggerated in the telling, and the very idea of a lost race of giants was tangled up, in that period, with an ugly and false notion that the mounds were too grand to have been built by the ancestors of Native Americans, that some vanished superior people must have raised them. That idea was wrong, and it was harmful, and one of the genuine achievements of the Smithsonian's Mound Survey was to prove correctly that the mounds were built by the ancestors of the native peoples who were still here. All of that is true, and it should be said. But notice what it does and does not explain. It explains why some giant stories were exaggerated. It does not explain why the physical remains, the actual measured bones from actual documented digs, so reliably vanish from the record rather than being preserved, displayed, and studied to settle the question once and for all. You do not need to believe in a lost superior race to be troubled by a simple fact. The one class of evidence that could end the argument in either direction is, over and over, the exact class of evidence that goes missing. So what is actually out there still, under the soybean rows and the lakefront lots and the golf courses of the American Midwest? The mound on Lake Lawn Farm is not a wild place anymore. That shoreline has been farmed and built and lived on for more than a century, since the Phillips brothers filled their trench back in. The cemetery itself is old. Nobody who vacations or golfs along Lake Delavan today gives a passing thought to the fact that 18 impossible skeletons were reportedly pulled out of the ground a stone's throw from where they are standing, because the register that once listed them is not on any shelf they will ever see, and the local histories have quietly rounded the whole affair down to a tall tale. But the mounds of Wisconsin are still there. Thousands of them survive, most never excavated at all, protected now by law, precisely because they are recognized as the sacred burial sites of living peoples. Whatever else lies inside them still. And the skeletons that did come out, the Delavan 18, the Maple Creek 3, the countless others reported across that long era, and then lost, did not evaporate. Bones do not evaporate. They were put somewhere, by someone. They are in a crate in a basement, or a drawer in a collection, or under a foot of fill where a mound used to be, waiting for a country that finally decides it actually wants to know. They were measured once. Some of them were photographed. They were real enough to print on a front page. And the only reason there were giants in Wisconsin sounds like a punchline to you, instead of an open question, is that the proof was allowed to slip away, over and over, in exactly the same manner, in exactly the same silence, until the losing of it became so ordinary that no one thought to be alarmed. 18 skeletons came out of a mound on Lake Delavan in the spring of 1912. Ask yourself where they are tonight. Ask why no one with the authority to find out has ever seemed to want to. And ask how many other mounds hold their own answer, 4 feet under the rows, in a landscape we drive across every day, without ever once wondering what is really down there, or who decided we should not look. If this discovery unsettled you, share it with one person. Just one. The ground under this country is full of chapters someone decided we shouldn't read, and they only get reopened if enough of us keep asking. I'll see you in the next dig. Until then, watch what they plough over.